Hi, my name is Mariana Insua, and I'm the program coordinator at the Center for Latin American Studies. We are very pleased to have Jean-Paul Faguet with us here today. Jean-Paul is a reader in the Political Economy of Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the chair of the Decentralization Task Force of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. He was also a visiting scholar here at UC Berkeley at the Center for Latin American Studies, and that's the time in which he worked on his new book, which he will be talking about today. So please join in welcoming Jean-Paul.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you to class for inviting me to come here and give this presentation, and thank you to all of you for being here. This book is a culmination, not this book actually, but that book. There we go. It's a culmination of 15 years of research that began way back in my PhD. And I never imagined that 15 years later I'd still be talking about these sorts of things. But as I sort of answered one set of questions, or at least thought I'd answered one set of questions, there were deeper, more interesting questions that kept pulling me along. And I had a very particular opportunity in Bolivia for sort of completely idiosyncratic reasons about when I first went to live there and things that information I got access to that sort of led me along. As Mariana said, I wrote this book during a wonderful sabbatical that I had in 2008, 2009, the first draft of the book, which was then revised in the normal way, and it was just published a few weeks ago over the summer. So it's a tremendous honor and very gratifying to be able to give this talk here at class and at Berkeley. Let me just show you very quickly before we get into the substance of this a website that might be of interest to PhD researchers and other scholars who are interested either in decentralization or Bolivia. This is a website onto which we have put, it's at the LSE, on the LSE domain, onto which we've put all the data and all the questionnaires, all the quantitative stuff and all the qualitative stuff that I used over 15 years of research in this book. And so, for example, here are all the data sets formatted for various ways as time series, as a panel data set, or also as cross-sectional data set, along with the key that explains all of the variables. And here is more information on the case studies, including all the questionnaires that I used in Spanish, the original questionnaires for doing the qualitative work, and a series of teaching aids and other things that might be of interest to students in particular. So it's just to let you know that that's there. And there's also, that website has a web-only chapter that didn't go into the book because the book would have become too long, but it's much more qualitative stuff on 7 of the case studies. And the full text of another book in Spanish, which is not the Spanish translation of this book. It's a different book co-authored with 2 Bolivian colleagues in Spanish, which is a much more historical take of going back to colonial times of the centrifugal versus centripetal tensions in Bolivian history. So it's looking at a similar topic, but it's a different take on it. So now let's get into this. Oops. Okay, there we go. How do I do just a normal show?
It's still normal.
Oh, okay, good. That's fine. Great.
You
Thank
just
you.
switched it, Jean-Paul.
Oh, no, that's not good. Oh, I need some technical help. I'm not a Mac person. I don't know. So I want that to be on both.
Swap displays.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, that's normal.
Yeah,
Well,
so you see this, everybody else sees that.
presenter view, Brittany.
Can I see the same thing? So I can't really read this in that form.
I don't think this version lets you do that.
This is a new version of PowerPoint that I've, I'm sorry.
It should be turn off presenter view.
Do you know?
it should be, let's see, where is
Oh, you did slide view, so see if you do okay if it fixes it now.
it? And then
Yeah.
It's still coming up presenter on the desktop though.
But you had it before.
Well, yeah, I guess what we could
I
do
mean,
is we could zoom
You can
in
also
here.
make the presenter part bigger,
Yeah.
the slide part bit bigger for
Okay.
him. So that, oh wow.
Let's just do a presenter view. That's fine. I'm sorry. I thought it was going to be a click, but if it's
No, it's not. I'm sorry.
yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay.
You can like drag this to make it bigger.
No, I don't think it does let you do that.
You can drag this to make it smaller. And then it makes it- I'll just do it.
There you go.
Ah, there we go. Okay,
At least
that's
a
good.
little bigger.
That's good. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, good. So this is the outline. I want to go through a slightly more extended motivation than is normal because I want to not just talk about, I'm going to talk about this research at great length, but I want to also give you a context for it and put it in the historical and literature-wise context in which this survey sits, because I'm going to try to convince you that this, not just this study, but this way of studying this theme is fundamentally better than the way that most of the literature has been using. And I realize it's an incredibly arrogant thing to say, but I think there's some reasons for believing that's true. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what happened when Bolivia decentralized and look first top-down at what happened in terms of nationwide trends, and then bottom-up in terms of local governance in two particular municipalities, which describe the extremes of good and bad government in Bolivia. And then we'll try to theorize from that, and if there's time, get to a quantitative empirical test, so an econometric test of those ideas. So first of all, the motivation. Decentralization is one of the broadest movements and most contentious policy issues in the world of development. We knew this was the case, and people like me were saying this kind of thing when I was doing my PhD in the 1990s. And we felt like it was a wave that was cresting, soon to be replaced by some other policy trend. And that didn't really happen. I mean, other policy trends came along, but decentralization never went away as one of the main things on the agenda of developing countries. So, for example, the World Bank in 1999 estimated that between 80 and 100% of the world's countries were experimenting with one or another form of decentralization now in the previous generation. Since 2000, another 25 to 30 new decentralization reforms have been announced or new reforms in 25 to 30 different countries in the world. So it's something that remains of great salience on the policy agenda. It's not only in poor countries, but also in the richest countries in the world, under the guises of subsidiarity in the EU, devolution in the UK, and federalism in the US. Arguably, subsidiarity and fiscal management, or devolution of fiscal management, or centralization of fiscal management is the key issue in the European economy, and arguably one of the key issues in the world economy right now, in terms of the euro and how it's managed, and countervailing fiscal authorities to do fiscal management alongside the common currency. It's not just the breadth across countries of decentralization, but also the depth of reforms. So Campbell in 2003 showed that in South America between 10 and 50% of all national resources were being devolved to subnational governments. Now, if we put this in historical terms, it's a tremendous reversal. If we put it in the very sort of Jared Diamond style, the very long term, what we see is that the last 15,000 years of history are really the history of increasing centralization in political and social affairs. So if we go back, say, 200,000 years ago, the earliest anatomically modern humans lived in small groups of a few dozen people, right? These were hunter-gatherers. They were, as far as we can tell, they were largely egalitarian and unorganized. It was difficult to infer this sort of social characteristic from the fossil record, but people who spend their lives studying this tell us that that's the best guess that we have. The big change comes about 10 to 15,000 years ago when we get settled agriculture and settled animal husbandry, domestication of plants and animals, which yield productivity gains of 10 to 100 times. Right? Not 10 to 100%, but 10 to 100 times more than hunter-gatherers achieved, which permit much larger settlements and much larger concentrations of people. And so we get groups now of a few hundred that begin acquiring primitive organizations and clear leaders. Farming improvements then continue, sort of the inframarginal changes from 10 to 100-fold increases in productivity take a long time to really to settle in. And these villages grow into chiefdoms as these populations become more productive, with populations now in the thousands, and centralized hereditary leaderships and multi-level bureaucracies. About 6,000 years ago, we get the first cities in the river valleys of what are today Egypt, Pakistan, India, and Iraq. And then 5,700 years ago, we get the first states, right, in Mesopotamia. And this is now a step change from the sorts of political organizations that we had before. We're talking about units, polities with 50,000 or more people. Clear capitals, but lots of other cities and villages within these states. And a number of important characteristics, which include centralized decision-making and control of information, sophisticated bureaucracies, and sophisticated religious orders. So a systematized religion with religious orders that manage that religion, systems of laws and judges, redistributive taxation, and a capital city, right? Now, this is not just exogenous or random change. It's not like the lay of the land is different in different countries. This yields a strong advantage to groups that organize themselves in this way. So when these first proto-states come into contact with bands of hunter-gatherers or with the earlier settlements, usually the proto-states win because they can project power. They can mobilize resources and project power. And so they win in war, and they win repeatedly in war, which gives them a sort of Darwinian advantage. From there, we get into the history that we all know, right? Roman and Persian empires 2,000 years ago. Rome collapses, and you get in Europe medieval European kingdoms, principalities, duchies, city-states, the Renaissance. From about the 17th century onward, nation-states. Now notice that until the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, we had increasing centralization and increasing complexity along these lines that coincided with an increasing size of the polity. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the polity breaks up. And you have lots of principalities, city-states, some kingdoms, duchies, etc., as I said, but the tools of centralization don't go away. So if it's Venice or Florence in the 12, 13, and 1400s, or the English court or the French court in the 17 and 1800s, they're all still using sophisticated bureaucracies and multi-level bureaucracies, centralized taxation, redistribution, etc., centralized religious orders that were first developed 5,700 years. So the centralization doesn't go away even when the polity breaks up, which is why increasing centralization is actually the defining characteristic of human political organization over the long term, over 10 to 15,000 years. And the rise of decentralization, that has been documented empirically in the last 50 years, is really a reversion of this historical trend. It's quite marked. No, it's a big change. But there's also a strong rationale for this. There's a reason for thinking that this is not a random change. History sometimes just changes for no particular reason, but this is not an example of this. Because theory provides a strong rationale, actually provides a bunch of rationales, but this is what I think is the strongest rationale in favor of decentralization. And that is the concept, the general idea of bringing government closer to the people, which should lead to better public goods and more effective government. Now, this closer to the people is more of a rallying cry or a cheerleading kind of thing, but we can break this down into separate intellectual arguments that are quite specific in favor of decentralization, which include that we can look at this from the supply side of policy and the demand side of policy. So on the supply side, the smaller scale of decentralized local government should facilitate better information, greater participation, and more accountability. And when these three things obtain, we should get a deepening of democracy in those places where these things happen. On the demand side, local units should be more homogeneous in terms of the populations and their needs and desires than the national unit. And so this local homogeneity should facilitate identifying local needs and tending to them, and answering needs or being responsive to these needs. Curiously, if theory gives us what I think, after spending a long time in this literature, are strong reasons, the empirical literature does not substantiate any of these ideas. So for example, just a few of I should say the empirical literature is enormous. There are literally hundreds of empirical studies over the last 40 years in peer-reviewed academic journals. If you include the so-called gray literature of studies by the World Bank and the IMF and various think tanks and NGOs, the number ascends into the thousands. And yet, taken as a whole, this empirical literature doesn't tell us whether any of those theoretical arguments are true, because the results are always mixed. So 3 influential studies, Litvak et al. In 1998, say that one can prove or disprove almost any proposition about decentralization by throwing together different sets of cases or data. Shah, Thompson, and Zhu, 5 years later, looking at more recent studies, find that decentralization sometimes improved, but other times worsened, service delivery, corruption, macroeconomic stability, and growth across a large range of countries. Most recently, and the most influential book, certainly of recent times, and one of the most influential books, period, is Treisman, 2007, Dan Treisman from UCLA, who finds that the results are inconclusive, weak, and contradictory. Empirical results are contradictory. To date, he says, there are almost no solid general empirical findings about the consequences of decentralization. And so we find ourselves in a bizarre paradox, where decentralization is being pursued almost everywhere in the world, if not everywhere in the world. Theoretical reasons are, in my view at least, and the view of many people, strong in favor of decentralization, and the empirical literature cannot tell us anything about whether this is a good or a bad thing. It's a very strange situation to be in. And I think there are reasons for this. And to summarize, I think the theory and the real policy enthusiasm about experimentation in the real world are correct, and I think the empirical literature is basically wrong. And it's wrong for these 3 reasons. One, there's a conceptual confusion. So there are lots of studies that began, especially between the 60s to the early 80s, began with a taxonomy of different kinds of decentralization, as if these were different flavors of decentralization. So you can decentralize your country in different ways. Some countries deconcentrate, other countries delegate power, other countries devolve power, some countries privatize, and some countries do a mix of some number of these different things. The problem is that when you analyze what each of these kinds of decentralization, what they mean, what we find is that they're fundamentally different reforms in incentive terms that set up fundamentally different incentives for which political agents and public officials respond differently, as you would expect them to do when faced with different incentives. So if we just look at 2 briefly, one country might deconcentrate. Deconcentration by definition is if the government takes public officials who are providing centralized public officials in the centralized bureaucracy that are providing public goods and services and sends them off to the periphery, out of Washington, D.C. or out of La Paz, to towns and villages throughout the country to do what they do there. But they're still public officials in the same organogram, in the same centralized bureaucratic structure. They've just been moved elsewhere, right? Compare that with devolution, when the government takes power and authority and resources over these functions and devolves those bundles of resources and power to locally elected governments. In the first case, excuse me, the incentives that the public officials that have been deconcentrated face are upward pointing incentives, right? Because their career trajectories, their success depends on what their bosses in the central ministry think of their performance. In the latter case, the career, the future success of these people depends on what their voters think about them, because they're working in devolved, democratically elected local governments, right? So their future is in the hands of voters, whereas here, the future of the comparable people is in the hands of higher level ministerial authorities. And these are fundamentally opposed, upward versus downward looking incentives. The problem is we study all 4 of these things as if they were the same, as if they were flavors or types under the same rubric, and that's just a fundamental mistake. Secondly, where is decentralization implemented? The problem is that effectively no central government that is being asked to decentralize wants to do that, right? Because the central government officials that by definition are being asked to hand over power and resources. Henceforth, I'm going to talk about decentralization as devolution, which I'll come to in the next slide. This is what I think is the best and clearest definition. It's something that is obviously different from what came before in any sort of reform process, which is centralization. So henceforth, when I say decentralization, I mean devolution, which by definition is a government handing over resources and power to people who are locally elected and therefore that it cannot completely control. No central government wants to do that. Any country that announces a decentralization faces a sort of rearguard battle on the part of the centralized bureaucracy that doesn't want to give away power and resources because it's giving away status and it's giving away patronage opportunities, You know, the people in the Ministry of Health or Education or Transport or wherever simply don't want to implement it, and they must implement it if it's going to work. No? And so how much decentralization that gets announced, how much of that is actually implemented in any country is a function of this, the power battle, I guess, the fight between the people who are trying to reform and the backlash on the part of people who hold power who are being asked to give it away and who don't want to. And so it's my view, again, after a long time looking at empirical results from different countries, that most countries that announce it simply haven't implemented or at best have implemented it partially. Secondly, a lot of studies have what I would call a non-rigorous empirical basis. There are many qualitative studies that look at a small number of countries where each country is an observation and then end up with a laundry list of 15 or 17 reasons. I'm thinking of a couple of studies in particular that I spent a lot of time on as a PhD student. 15 to 17 reasons why decentralization produced different results in, for example, Mexico, India, and Indonesia. The problem with this kind of study is that you have 3 observations and 17 unknowns, right? So, I mean, as a mathematical system, you can't solve a system that has 17 variables and 3 equations. It just can't be done. Quantitative results get around this problem, but at a very high cost. Quantitative results are typically cross-country analyses based on panel data sets. I've just reviewed one for the American Political Science Review that had 125 countries in the panel data set, which is great. So they get around this numerical problem, the problem of too few observations, at a high cost that these countries vary in significant ways in terms of their history, their legal structures, their constitutions, their traditions, culture, the extent to which people, groups, different groups within any given country can solve the collective action problem or not. And these differences really matter for decentralization outcomes. Right? They may not matter if you're an economist and you're studying the marginal effect of raising or lowering the tax rate, but they do matter in terms of decentralization. They can be critical to what we expect to find in decentralization, but the data set cannot control for these different things. And lastly, I think, and most simply, but I think most powerfully, we've been asking the wrong question. This is for me, right? Great, thank you. And we've been asking a question which is weirdly centralized, given the topic that we're studying. We're asking a simple question: is decentralization good or bad for policy variable X? For education, for health, for corruption, for stability? As if you decentralize and you flip a switch that has a monotonically similar effect across the country, right? And that's just, it's an odd sort of centralized way of thinking about it. I'll explain further in a moment. So the solution, and what I've tried to do in this study, is threefold. First, what I think of as a rigorous and a restrained, a restricted definition. Decentralization is democratic devolution to local governments that are independent of the center in a particular geographic and functional domain. And that's all. And if the country hasn't done this, I'm not going to call it a decentralizing country, and I'm not going to study it alongside countries that have done this. Secondly, empirical rigor, what I call a large N one country study. So we have econometrics, we have panel databases, but the observations are municipalities, they're not countries. It's all within one country with the same history, colonial legacy, geography, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to combine or marry that quantitative work with deep qualitative research at the local level based on hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews in different case studies. And hopefully the two will permit a fine-grained, nuanced analysis of why things happen, not just what happened, but why these things happened. And lastly, the right question, which is, like, it's best if I say it this way. It seems to me that the obvious answer to the question, is decentralization good for any variable X that you care about? So let's say primary education. Is yes, of course it is. Decentralization is good for primary education. No? In any country that decentralizes, some localities will improve primary education, and so decentralization was good for primary education. And the obvious answer to the question, is decentralization bad for primary education, is yes, of course it is. It's also bad for primary education in that same country, measured in the same way in the same period of time. Because in other municipalities, they'll screw it up. They won't invest in primary education, they'll try, but it'll go badly, they'll be corrupt, they'll just have bad luck. Right? Things go wrong for all sorts of reasons. And so the way to begin getting into this question is not to ask, is decentralization good or bad for anything, but is to presuppose that the results of decentralization in any field that we care about, in any dimension that worries us, are going to be heterogeneous. And they're going to be as heterogeneous as the underlying heterogeneity of all those localities. In a country like Bolivia, different municipalities are wildly different to one another. And we should expect them to perform very differently in education, in health, in roads, etc. And so the real question is, why are the good good and why are the bad bad? Accept heterogeneity from the start. Don't look at it from the top down, from the president on down, and expect one kind of simple monotonic answer, but rather try to explain the heterogeneity. Oops. Okay, so that's my extended introduction. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. Bolivia decentralized in 1994 with the law of popular participation, which was a radical and sincere reform. Radical because it was very quick and unexpected, and it took a form which is quite different to what little had been discussed in the previous 3 decades. And sincere because they really did it. And we can get into the why of that later on in the questions if there's interest. What they did is basically 4 components. One, they doubled total resource allocation of all the money that was devolved to localities. More interestingly, more importantly, they changed the allocation between municipalities from highly political ad hoc criteria, sort of criteria-less criteria, to a strict per capita basis. So in one municipality that has 1,000 people, they got 155,000 Bolivianos in the first year. In La Paz with 1 million, they got 155 million Bolivianos in the first year, straight per capita. Secondly, they devolved responsibility for and ownership over the infrastructure in a set of services that are pretty much what the literature says should be decentralized. So primary education, primary health, local irrigation schemes, local roads, not trunk roads or highways, and local sports and culture. Thirdly, they created oversight committees, these comités de vigilancia, which are a sort of alternative channel for popular demands that have legal parity with the municipal government per se, with the mayor and the municipal council. And fourthly, municipalization. They created afresh, anew, 2/3 of all municipalities in the country. So at the end of the reform, Bolivia had 311 municipalities. 198 of these did not exist even legally. They were not legally incorporated, let alone were there authorities or a budget or an office where they could meet. So these governments were created. And existing governments were expanded to include rural catchment areas so that all Bolivians and all Bolivian space were included in one or another municipality. Most of the country was unorganized territory beforehand. So now all of Bolivia and all Bolivians had a local government that responded to them, or that at least in theory responded to them. So what happened? It's possible that a country decentralizes and the central government was doing more or less okay beforehand, and the local government, all the local governments do more or less okay afterwards, and very little changes, right? It's theoretically possible. So we have to establish, did anything change? So what this graph shows is the sum of the last 3 years before decentralization, i.e. the last 3 years of the centralized regime, which are the dark blue bars, and the sum of the first 3 years of investment under local governments, which are the yellow bars. This is incremental investment. These are not running costs. So this is investment in services, as in building new schools or water and sanitation projects or roads or whatever. And it's a simple revealed preference argument to say, what did different levels of government care about? Did local versus central governments care about the same thing, or did they care about different things? And what we see is that they cared about radically different things. Central government prioritized transport, followed by hydrocarbons, energy, and this grab bag multi-sectoral category, which is a bunch of stuff. Local governments after reform prioritized first education, then urban development. Most of the municipalities didn't exist and didn't have offices, so that one of the first things they did was to build lots of offices and buy buildings and this kind of thing, so they would have a place to work. Then water and sanitation, then transport, then health. So you see a big switch after decentralization away from economic production and infrastructure and towards human capital accumulation in primary services like education, water, and health. Another way that we can ask this question, what changed, is how did the pattern of investment across space change? So if we look at investment across municipalities, which one was more equal or more unequal in terms of the allocation across space, local or central government? So let's ask ourselves, what is the theoretical maximum of inequality, the most unequal distribution of resources that any government could achieve? That would be one black dot here, right? Each of these, sorry, I should have said, each of these black dots is a municipality expressed in Bolivianos per capita. So think of it in terms of dollars per capita. The average exchange rate for this period is about 5 Bolivianos per US dollar. So the theoretical extreme of inequality would be one municipality getting all the money up here and everybody else getting nothing, right? That is as unequal a distribution across space that any government could choose. The most equal distribution would be all the municipalities at some intermediate level lined up at the same level in per capita terms. So all municipalities got 15, let's see, this is in thousands, so 1.5 thousand Bolivianos per capita, let's say. If they all got the same, that would be highly equal. What we actually, so these two here are, again, what central government did. Now I'm summing the last 7 years before reform, 1987 to 93 inclusive. So the sum of the last 7 years of centralized government. And here we see what local governments did after reform. What central government chose to do before reform is not quite the theoretical maximum of inequality, but is pretty close. You know, you have one municipality up here that's getting 77,000 Bolivianos per capita, which in Bolivian terms is a vast amount of money. Another one getting 42,000, another one getting 21,000 Bolivianos, and then some down here that seem to be at lower levels. Of course, these very high observations are compressing the vertical axis. So in this graph, I simply drop the highest 12 observations. I just get rid of them, which allows me to expand the vertical axis like this, and we can see more detail. And indeed, there is more variation at these lower levels. But if you count all the black dots that are at exactly 0 Bolivianos per capita, it comes out to 40% of Bolivian municipalities during the 7 years before reform. 40% of Bolivian municipalities got absolutely nothing. This isn't close to 0. This doesn't mean a low number. This is exactly mathematically 0, 0.0000 Bolivianos. Year in and year out over 7 years. The central government chose to invest nothing in 40% of Bolivian municipalities. After reform, we see a much more equal distribution across space. That's not surprising because of the per capita criterion that I just described. If you look at the data long and hard for reasons that are probably not worth going into in great detail, you see that there's an obvious periodicity, which has to do with external shocks and natural resource prices. And the data breaks down into the first 3 years after reform, then 97 to 2002, and then 2003 to 2007. And so you see rising inequality over time as the natural resource flows kick in and oil and gas prices go through the roof in the noughties. But even the highest series here, 2003 to 2007, is nowhere near the level of inequality that central government freely chose. Right? And these are executed funds. So this is real investment. These aren't flows into the municipality. This is executions out of the municipal accounts, as it were. So a last way, excuse me, that we can ask the question, what changed, is, did investment become more or less sensitive to real needs? And I'm going to use proxies sector by sector. I'm just going to show you education for lack of time, but I did the same sort of thing for water, health, transport, sanitation, flood defenses, etc. So I'm using some sort of objective indicator from the census. In this case, it's the illiteracy rate, as a proxy, as an indicator of objective local needs, not subjective as in asking people what they want or what they need, but objective as an objective, objectively defined indicator. And the logic is as follows. Compare the two extreme observations here, the lowest illiteracy rate municipality and the municipality with highest illiteracy rate there. My argument is that all else equal, in this place, almost nobody knows how to read. Right? The illiteracy rate is about 85%. And in this place, almost everybody does know how to read. The illiteracy rate is something like 8%. Right? So all else equal, this place needs more education investment than that place does. They both need education investment. But all else equal, this place needs more. And so a pattern of investment that is responsive to local need would look like this. It would be an upwardly sloping line. I mean, it doesn't matter exactly what the slope is, but it would be an upwardly sloping line. A pattern of investment that is regressive in terms of need, that exacerbates the differences pre-existing, would be a downward sloping line. And so the question is, how did each regime do? And what we see is that under centralized government, again, the last 7 years before decentralization, we have a flat line, which is this red line there. That's the regression line of illiteracy rate on Bolivianos per capita. Now, if I do the same trick and I expand the vertical axis by dropping the highest 12 observations, this line, we see that this line turns slightly negative, but the slope is not statistically significant, so this is basically a flat line, which means that the central government invested with no reference to local needs. In some municipalities that had very high need, they invested little money. In other municipalities that had very low need, relatively low need compared to the other ones, they invested little money, and they just didn't pay much attention to it. After decentralization, you see that the line is positive and is strongly significant at the 1% level. So local governments, and then that slope actually gets slightly more positive as we go from the first period to the second period, to 1997 to 2002. The third one, the third period just doesn't fit on the graph, but it's similar. So local governments did invest with sensitivity to local needs, investing much more in education in many more municipalities across the board, but also investing more, relatively more, where need was higher, and less in education where need was lower, because in these places here, where the illiteracy rate is lower, they choose to invest more in other sectors, like water, or roads, or agriculture. The other interesting thing, and maybe the more important thing, is how few municipalities receive any investment at all under central government. Under the centralized regime, 85% of municipalities receive zero investment in education year in and year out for 7 years before reform. The government chose to invest nothing in 85% of Bolivian municipalities. It only invested some non-zero value in 15%. After reform, 97% of Bolivian local governments choose to invest in education. So that's part of what we said before, that they value education much more highly than the center did before. So we have 4 stylized facts of what happened in Bolivia with decentralization. First, it shifted public investment from production to human capital formation and primary services. Second, this shift was driven by smaller, poorer, more rural municipalities. Third, there's greater spatial equality as the per capita criterion shifts resources massively towards smaller, poorer, more rural districts. And fourthly, local government investments are far more responsive to local need than the center was before. And I should say that all 4 of these are actually substantiated with some fairly heavy econometric work. I'm only showing you the colorful graph because it's easier, but they make the same point. But I'm not basing this empirically on those graphs. I'm basing it on hopefully properly identified regressions. So now let's understand why this was the case. And let's do this by looking deeply at what happened in 2 particular local governments amongst my case studies, which are the worst and the best case. And I want to take you to Viacha, which is here on the old southern highway south from La Paz towards Oruro, and also Charagua. So this is up in the Altiplano, in the department of La Paz. And Charagua is down in Santa Cruz, where the foothills, so the high Altiplano breaks into the mountains, and then the foothills, the Yungas, and so on. And right where the foothills end and you get the vast eastern Chaco Plain is where Charagua is. Now, standard public administration theories would predict that government would be much better in Viacha, up on the Altiplano, than down here in Charagua, because Viacha is much richer. It's an industrial city. It's the 13th richest municipality in Bolivia. It has a number of big factories. It has some fairly capital-intensive production. It has lots of cheap transport because it's on 2 major highways. It sits directly on the main asphalted road, and the other main road going south, the newer highway, also goes through the municipal space of Viacha. And it's also much smaller. And so it's richer. Oh, and lastly, it's very close to La Paz. And so it can rely on the technical and human resources of the big La Paz El Alto conurbation. So if the mayor of Viacha wants to build a school or plan a local road or an irrigation system, he's not relying only on local technicians that live in Viacha. He can go and fish in the big labor pool of much more highly qualified people around La Paz. In Charagua is very rural. 75% of the population are Guarani speakers who live subsistence agriculture. And the municipality is enormous. It's 72,000 square kilometers. Does anyone have any sense of how big 72,000 square kilometers is? You know how big Costa Rica or Holland or Belgium are? Belgium is 30,000 square kilometers. So Charagua, the municipality of Charagua is 2.5 times the size of Belgium, with apologies to any Belgians who might be present. Belgium's a lovely country, but it's not that big. Charagua is huge, and it doesn't have a single paved road in the whole place. The paved road now peters out most of the way to Charagua, but it doesn't make it. Before, when I began doing research, it petered out about a half hour out of Santa Cruz. During the rainy season, which is about 4 months of the year, the roads are washed out, and it becomes physically impossible for the mayor to get across this vast area that he's supposed to rule over, so that he can't go to the poor Guarani community strung along here in the Alto and Bajo Isoso, running right along the Paraguayan border all the way up to here, to the Brazilian border, and find out what's going on with the school constructions, what are their needs, what happened with the participative planning, has there been an outbreak of dengue or malaria or anything else that he might be called upon to answer, because he can't physically get there. And as I said before, it's a very poor place where most people are subsistence farmers. So you'd expect Viacha to be good and Charagua to be bad, and in fact, we got exactly the opposite result. In Viacha, local government was unresponsive, violent, and corrupt. And so some evidence for this: the local government expanded the payroll by more than 100%. After taking over, after decentralization, without increasing administrative ability or technical skills of the municipality at all. It wasn't able to do more than it had been able to do before, despite doubling the headcount. You had projects like white elephant projects, like a huge municipal coliseum, which was meant to attract sporting events from La Paz, which was unfinished and over budget when I first went there in 1997. And the last time I went to Viacha in 2009, it was still unfinished and massively more over budget, because it had been badly designed and badly built, and so they kept having to tear down large parts of it and rebuild it. There's an exploding sewerage project. So the mayor accepted a contribution from a contractor, and then after he won, allocated to him a big contract to dig up the old sewerage pipes, which were about 30 years old, and the argument was it was sort of time for them to be changed. And the contractor put in pipes whose diameter was too small, and they had been manufactured with too much sand in the sand-cement mixture, so they were structurally weak. They dug out the old pipes, put in the new pipes, covered it all up again, and 3 months later, the sewage literally exploded up onto the streets and sidewalks of Viacha, throwing the stuff that sewers carry up into public view, and creating huge craters in the city streets in downtown Viacha, such that they had to board off or block off a bunch of city streets that were impassable. You could walk down if you dared, but you couldn't drive down those streets. Public officials, municipal councilmen, and the mayor's political boss all declared to me that they had serious problems in Viacha, and the root of those problems are that the mayor was corrupt. This is so that his boss, the head of the political party that had nominated him, swore to me that he was corrupt. And a national audit charged the mayor with malfeasance. So, when I say that they had bad government, I want you to believe it, not just because I'm saying it, but there's a lot of evidence there that this was the case. Why? Well, you had a corrupt and corrupting mayor, an ineffective municipal council, and an oversight committee, that new institution that I mentioned before, that had been neutralized and corrupted. So the mayor simply fired the previous oversight committee officials that had been duly elected and put into office. He simply fired them, he changed the locks on the door, and then he hired his own oversight committee president and vice president, who were a couple of guys from the extreme south in Potosí, who didn't know Viacha and were not known in Viacha, weren't sort of familiar with issues and problems in Viacha. And then he paid them a salary. He gave them the keys to the office and paid them a salary, which is strictly illegal because they're supposed to be conducting oversight over what he does. So, this is fine, but they're fairly simplistic and stupid answers to the question, why is government going badly in Viacha, right? Because you have a bad mayor and you have an ineffective municipal council. So let's look for deeper causes, and we can break this down into 3 categories of the local economy, the local political party system, and civil society. And so you had, in terms of the economy, one dominant firm, one firm that was very big and very rich, and it was hyperactive in terms of its political engagement, which was the brewery. It acted with fiercely partisan aggression to support its own party, which was the UCS, because the UCS and the CBN, the Cervecería Boliviana Nacional, and the UCS political party were basically two sides of the same coin. They were both founded by Max Fernandez, a very rich guy, sort of unschooled or self-schooled guy who was a truck driver who became the owner of the big, by far the biggest beer company in Bolivia. He consolidated a bunch of smaller companies, and then he started his own political party. But he ran them as one consolidated enterprise. So politics and beer were the two products that they sold with one organization. And that was reflected very much, very strongly locally in Viacha. So the head of the UCS in Viacha was the head of the local bottling factory. That's what the beer company was in Viacha. They had a bottling plant there. And so the head of the bottling plant was the guy I referred to earlier, the head of the UCS. And so he put the beer company's assets and manpower at the disposal of the party to run campaigns and to try to win votes. But he also actively undermined the competition. And so to explain this, I should speak a bit in his own words, which are very dirty, I should warn you. This guy, a big bear of a man, Juan Carlos Blanco, the head of the UCS CBN. And he liked to swear a lot. And so I asked him, you yourself, Don Juan Carlos, you say that your mayor is corrupt, and yet you win election after election after election. How do you do this? And back then they were having elections every 2 years. That was changed since then. But back then it was just all the time, and they won all these elections. How do you stay on top like this? I don't understand. And he said, God damn it, the problem with you asshole academics is that you don't understand anything about the world. So I'm going to explain to you how the world works. Here's how the world works. I went to the MIR, one of the opposition political parties. They were going to run this goddamn candidate who was the old doctor that everybody loves, because he's delivered like half the damn town, right? I mean, he was there delivering the babies, and these babies have grown up and they're now voters. And so all these people are going to vote for this guy. And I said to the head of that political party, you cannot run with the doctor in the #1 position on your ballot. You have to put him below #5. Now, there are only 5 municipal councilmen in the town, so if you were in position 6 or below, that basically made it impossible for you to get elected on any ticket, let alone that particular political party. But even the UCS ticket wasn't going to get 5 people into the municipal council of 5 members, right? They had 3 at the time, and 3 was already sort of doing extremely well. So you've got to take this doctor that everyone loves, and you put him below #5, 6 on down. And you get my man Lopez, and you put him in the #1 spot on your ticket. And the guy from the MIR looked at me, he said, with his eyes desorbitados. And he said, but Don Juan Carlos, Lopez is corrupt. Everyone knows he's corrupt. Everyone loves the doctor. Why would I do that? He said, God damn it, that's exactly why you need to do that. Because everyone knows this guy's corrupt, and if you do this, I'm going to give you $10,000, and you can do anything you want. You can run a campaign, you can take your fat wife to Miami. I don't care. You do anything you want. Here's the money. But if you don't, and if you run the doctor in the #1 slot on the ballot, I am going to screw you. I'm going to make war against you, and you're going to regret this until the day that you die. So then I thought, this is incredible. And I went and I spoke to the head of the MIR. And what do you think the MIR told me? He told me the same story, minus the bad language, with a slightly different spin on it. He said, yes, effectively, estamos aquí muy olvidados. The National Party in La Paz never pays any attention to us. They don't send us 2 centavos for our political campaign. We never have any resources to do anything, so we don't get very many votes. I can only do a couple of rallies in the city. I can't go anywhere into the countryside, which is also part of the Viachan municipality. And so the Cervecería very generously gave us $10,000. And I accepted it as a political donation. And of course, on that basis, we had a certain discussion about a couple of political issues. And if you look at the filings, you see that the doctor was in the initial filing, which was unamended before the election, and Lopez was in the 1st spot, and the doctor was in the 6th spot. So it's very clear. You know, it's very clear what was going on, and you have it from both sides. And so as a result, and this is just one vignette, this kind of thing was going on. Political competition was being undermined all the time in this place by this beer interest, such that political party competition was neutralized, little political competition, and no substantive policy choice. So parties, to the extent that they competed in giving little gifts to the voters in exchange for their votes. So the UCS CBN color was blue. You would go to rallies with immense banners that would say, vote for the UCS, and then underneath another banner that said, drink Paseña beer. And the workers had blue overalls, and the overalls said Paseña beer on the front and UCS on the back, which was a political party. And At a time when when voter turnout was increasing 127% across the country because of decentralization and a bunch of other reforms that made it easier to register and get your documentation and more voting booths in rural areas. At the same time as decentralization, in Viacha, voting totals were collapsing. So turnout collapsed by 40% in exactly the same period, because people rationally could see that there was no substantive political competition. Whatever they wanted and whoever they voted for, they got the UCS in power, and so they simply stopped turning out to vote. You might think, if you think along Putnamite lines, that civil society might, or social capital might be able to solve this problem. It couldn't in Viacha, because the civil society was divided between the city, the white European city, that's how they thought of themselves, that's how they described themselves, and the Machacas region. And the countryside, and then the countryside itself was divided between the Machacas, which is one bit of the countryside, and the other part that was closer into the city. And you had widespread distrust, episodic outbreaks of violence. There was even a homicide in the municipal building that was almost certainly due to some sort of political intrigue. And the collective action problem in civil society repeatedly failed to be solved. Now in Charagua, we can do this a bit faster because it's a good case. In Charagua, you had a very responsive, participative local government that was led by strong organizations, a good mayor, a very vigorous, active municipal council, and a strong oversight committee that actually conducted oversight. So some quick evidence, so you don't just believe me. The mayor topped a departmental ranking as the best mayor in the Department of Santa Cruz and one of the best mayors in the country, at a time when they had a resource shock from decentralization of 6,500%. Their budget increased by 6,500% from one year to the next. They kept operating costs down to 4% throughout. So the exact opposite of Viacha, where the planilla increased by more than 100%. National government audits that damned Viachan government concurred that this government was very good. And most impressively for me, in hundreds of interviews, local testimony overwhelmingly concurred. I didn't have anyone tell me that government was corrupt or bad or twisted in any way. There were substantive disagreements about policy priorities. They're investing too much in education, or they're investing too much in this region. They need to invest more in roads or in irrigation. But these are legitimate policy differences. Nobody said this guy's corrupt or this guy has ill will, let's say. Everyone said he's trying hard. So if we look at the deeper causes here, we had an economic structure which is much more competitive, which consisted in Charagua of ranchers. Ranchers are basically family-owned businesses that were much more pluralistic than one big monolithic company run by one guy, right? Even where the ranchers tended to be more center or right-wing in their preferences, they preferred the MNR or the ADN political parties, which is more sort of centrist towards the right, they would still give contributions, political contributions, to center-left and left-wing political parties, por si acaso, just in case, because you never know. It's good to be in good with people because you never know who will win the election. And this tended to support an open, competitive political system that was open to new entrants. And so you have an example of what I like to call political entrepreneurialism, which is where a politician or a political party can identify a group of people that have particular needs or particular wants that are not being tended to by the status quo, propose policies in their interest and get elected and capture their votes, right? So you can think of this as entrepreneurialism in the political sphere. And there's a brilliant example of this in Charagua, which is when a left-wing NGO went in league with the mere political party, the same party that I was talking about in Viacha, and approached the local Guarani leaders and said to them, listen, now with decentralization, you guys are 75% of the electorate. If you organize yourself and if you vote for the same party, you will win any election. This wasn't the case before, because before local government was restricted to the town and the Guaranis live in the countryside. But now that the borders have been expanded to include Guarani villages, you guys are the vast majority. So let's do a deal. Let's discuss a platform. What are the Guarani needs? What can the municipal government do differently to start to attend to the needs of these villages, which are very poor, which don't have electricity or running water. Many don't have schools. Almost none had at this time clinics or hospitals. So let's discuss this, and then you guys pick a candidate And nosotros le ponemos la camiseta. We'll put a t-shirt on him that says Mir, right, of our political party. But you don't have to pick a member of ours. You can pick anyone you want. And we'll instantly induct him into the party. We'll put this t-shirt on him, and he will be our candidate. And then you, the Guaranese, take one last step, which is to get your people to vote. And if you can get your people, because remember the Guaranese are not used to voting. They were formally and informally, tacitly and explicitly discouraged from voting over generations. So if you get your people out to vote, we'll win the election. And they did this deal. The Guaranese nominated somebody. They put the t-shirt on them, and the Mir strode into the local government. Having never exceeded 5% of the vote previously, they won the election and became the new government there. And then lastly, you had a highly structured, coherent civil society with high social capital, or a high degree of organization is how I prefer to think of it. This APG, the Asamblea del Pueblo Guaraní, these are the Guarani leaders I was referring to, is a civic organization rooted in Guarani traditions of self-government at the village level, which when it was formed only about 7 years before decentralization, immediately got a high degree of legitimacy and capacity to mobilize opinion and to mobilize efforts on the part of the Guarani people. And so if we think about these two contrasting cases, and in reality I was also thinking about the other case studies that I did, that I don't have time to talk about here, I think we can arrive at a theory of where we get local government responsiveness and accountability. So how can we explain where we have good government and where we have bad government, where good and bad is defined explicitly in terms of responsiveness and accountability? And it seems to me like the most important factor in generating a responsive, accountable government is open, substantive competition in politics. When you have a politics that's captured by one interest, or where competition is being somehow constrained, you're not going to tend to get accountable local government or responsive government. But where politics is open and competitive and new entrants can generate new proposals and try to get elected, and you have that political entrepreneurialism, it's much more likely that you have good quality government. The problem is that this is endogenous, right? This is not a given across municipalities. It's not a feature of Viacha like the fact that it's up on the Altiplano and Charagua is down in the Chaco. Right? This is something that can change over relatively short periods of time. What is it endogenous to? It seems to me that it's endogenous to two things. One is economic interests and the political engagement of these economic interests. So whether you have a diverse, heterogeneous local economy or a monolithic, one big actor, the opposite of diversity and heterogeneity in the local economy, and on the civil society front, where you have many active organized groups or not. Where you do, and where these economic actors and the social actors interact through politics, you're going to tend to get an open, competitive politics that then yields responsive local government. So this is the key. Whether you have many active organized groups in civil society and a diverse, heterogeneous economy, and again, they're interacting through politics because each group wants what they want, and they want different things. Local businesses, it depends on the business and the place, but local businesses might want more roads, for example. They're probably not going to want lots more schools. Up here, local civil society, in my experience in Bolivia, especially in rural, poor areas, always want more schools because the quality of education in Bolivia is very poor. So this is something, education is something they want more. Well, if they interact through politics, then we can start to get a dynamic where the government will then attend to these needs. So the last thing that I'll do is to try to test these econometrically. And the way that I do that is as follows. I'm going to regress per capita investment sector by sector in education, and then separately in health, and then agriculture, and so on and so forth. But I'm only going to show you education for lack of time. And I'm going to regress it on these indicators, which come from the theory. So we've got economic actors, civil society actors, and their interactions. Because remember that politics is endogenous, so I'm not going to include politics in the model. And so here we have the number of firms and civil society actors, and then interactions between them. And also this is, let's see, N is the stock of public goods. So this is like that graph I showed you with illiteracy. So for the education regression, N will be the illiteracy rate. It'll be something different according to each sector. And then I interact all of these things where I build up to this three-way interaction, which is where the real action is. This is the key term here, where we interact the needs variable with the number of firms, with the number of civic society organizations. And then I've got a bunch of controls here that try to account for heterogeneity across municipalities in Bolivia. And this is the empirical strategy, which is just to add in, to start off with the base regression here, and then add in more interactions until I come up with the full specification. But this is the real equation here, the long one, that includes all the interactions. And if the theory is supported, then the interaction terms should matter. And what you see is that they do. So this is the result for education. The literacy rate is significant, so it looks like local governments are investing according to local need. But when we add the interactions, significance starts to go away on need by itself, because significant comes in here. Statistical significance comes in here when we interact needs with the number of firms and the number of grassroots organizations. And also the firms and grassroots organizations by themselves are also statistically significant. And the effects are quite large. They're large real effects or resource effects. So these interactions are the single biggest determinant of investment patterns in education, also in health, also in agriculture, so on and so forth. And the size of it is as follows. A 1 standard deviation increase in illiteracy, given dense, firm, grassroots interactions, where these things exist in abundance and appear to be interacting with one another, a 1 standard deviation increase in illiteracy yields an increase of almost 1 million Bolivianos per 1,000 people, which in a poor country like Bolivia is actually a big difference. It's a big chunk of money. And the independent effects of grassroots organizations and firms on need responsiveness are small and nil, respectively. And need becomes insignificant when you include these interactions. So this just sort of supports the theory that I was arguing for before. The same is true for urban development. The same is true for health. I mean, I need to finish because I know we want time for questions. Lastly, I went back to these places 13 years later to see what was going on. So the initial qualitative research was done 13 years ago, and I went back recently to see. I mean, I went back in between also, but I went back most recently to sort of sum up what changes had happened. In Viacha, what's interesting, the bad case, is that local government has been transformed. Before it was bad, unresponsive, corrupt. Now you have open, transparent, and responsive governance. This happened after about a decade of bad government. It continued after my initial round of research. But at the end of this decade, you suddenly got a big change. And so evidence for saying that government is better, all 63 rural communities now have electricity, which wasn't the case beforehand. Most now have potable water, and all will soon. 70% of schools have internet. I think this is higher than the case in England, for example. The mayor reports quarterly on what's going on. The weekly oversight committee, there are weekly reports to the oversight committee, so with even greater frequency. And the spending is planned down to the district and community level. So district and community organizations plan their own spending. It's not all done in town hall in Viacha. 3 successive national audits praise the municipality, and the UNDP ranking put them in the top 6 of all municipalities in the country from the bottom few, from being one of the very worst in the country to one of the best. So how did this change come about? Well, as I said, they went along very badly with very bad governments that were chronically corrupt, and where the municipal council kept throwing out the mayor every year or 2 years to be replaced by another person who also performed poorly for a decade. It was a very sad story. And then about 5 years ago, an exogenous shock, which lifted an external constraint. Quilmes, the Argentine brewery, bought the CBN, the Cervecería Boliviana Nacional, that big beer company, and they simply chose to close down the plant in Viacha. And I'm sure this has nothing to do with politics, because Quilmes and the Argentines don't give a toss about politics in Viacha. This is a simple private sector decisión empresarial. It was a profit-maximizing decision to consolidate bottling where they make the beer, as opposed to brew the beer one place and then ship it somewhere else to be bottled. But when they did this, they lifted an important constraint on local politics. And this allowed civil society to begin to organize itself into assent, because it was no longer being undermined by the action of the brewery. They became far more organized and assertive. A modernizing candidate appeared and promised transparency and efficiency. This was not the first time this had happened, but this time he got elected, partly because he was no longer being undermined by the action of the brewery. And voters I think voters had learned the costs of conflict and paralysis by this bitter experience of 10 years of bad government. Now, my fear is that I'd go back to Charagua and find that things had gotten worse and broken down, and they just sort of flipped in status. But that was not the case. In Charagua, local government has improved further, and participation and transparency have deepened considerably. So, for example, all rural communities now have schools, and almost all have health posts and electricity. This is up from almost none before. This is a staggering increase. There are 93 rural communities, again, in a space 2.5 times the size of Belgium. So to me, to my mind, this is a significant achievement. Budgeting and planning were devolved to the district and village level, so they do their own planning and their own budgeting and their own control and their own execution of financial resources, of public resources. The mayor gives quarterly reports on works and budget, like his similar in Viacha. Communities manage budgets and projects directly, and Charagua was rated the 3rd best municipality nationwide, in a nationwide ranking. How did it improve? Well, this Guarani People's Association entered politics directly. There is a national change in the law that before you had to be a political party organized from La Paz outwards, and you had to have certain characteristics, and politics was not open to civic groups. You had to be legally constituted as a party. That law was changed, and so the APG entered politics directly, and the APG, along with the MAS, with Evo Morales' MAS, brought political stability over the last 5 years, which Charagua had not had. Even though it was a relatively good performer, they had not had that political stability. Like many other places in Bolivia, they changed their mayor very frequently. And under that stable political regime, they were able to deepen local decentralization further in the way that I've described. And crucially, the rich white, again, so self-described white ranchers in this part of the world, who are the rich people there, and it's a small group, but they're much richer than the Guarani majority, have chosen to continue working with the Guarani-led local government. People feared that they would, in effect, defect, that they would conduct some sort of war, formally or informally, against the local government, which was led by Guaranis, whom they considered as their grandfathers thought of as their slaves not that long ago, and that's just not the case. And so in Charagua, good government and participation have led to an endogenous rise in local standards and expectations for local government. And you see this very clearly. When you go and speak to villagers, even in remote places on the border with Paraguay, people's expectation of what local government can do for them is out of all comparison with what people expect anywhere else in Bolivia, because they've seen local government acting at a much higher level. They've gotten used to that, and they know that if they vote in a particular way, and especially if they participate, and if they make demands on local government, their local government will respond. So that you have an endogenous rise in standards and expectations of what local government should be like in Charagua. And I think you're starting to get that now in Viacha, which is part of the Virtuous circle in Viacha as well. So to wrap it up, what are the determinants of local government responsiveness? Well, it seems to me that my evidence suggests that neither economic interests nor social forces alone can explain Viacha and Charagua, or the database results from all 311 municipalities. My database includes the universe of Bolivian municipalities, right? There are no sampling issues. Everyone's in it. Neither one nor the other, so this goes against the Putnamite view of social capital and that social capital literature that it's all about trust or it's all about civic organizations. What I'm saying is that it's not about one or the other, but the interaction of the two. And this is where the econometric results come in. You see that where you have lots of civic groups or where you have lots of economic actors, you don't necessarily get needs-responsive policy making. But where you have both and where they interact with one another, you do. And the results, again, the results are quite big. Politics appears to be endogenous to the interaction of economic actors and civic organizations. It's not an independent variable by itself. And then lastly, if I can step way back and talk about how we study things like this. It seems to me, as I said at the beginning, there's a class of phenomena where rules, complex organizations, and individuals interact in a context that's heavily influenced by culture, history, social norms, constitutional trajectories, legal systems, etc. And that studying this stuff either with small numbers of country studies, qualitative country studies, or large databases, either one or the other, is the wrong way to do it. for the reasons that I described previously. And the way to do it is along the lines of what I've tried to do here, which is a one country large N study, where you have econometric results that have statistical significance and a certain amount of explanatory power, but they're within one country. So the large number of observations are within a country and not across countries. And so you control for all of that exogenous variation, but you have to marry that to qualitative research, because only the qualitative research can tell you what is the social mechanism that's going on. It allows you to understand in depth what happened in each country before comparing amongst them. So ideally, to get at a better sense of decentralization across, for example, Latin America, we would have a series of studies broadly like this that look deeply country by country, and then we compare across countries once we have some knowledge of what's going on in each one, as opposed to a data set with 125 countries and little qualitative evidence. Great, I'm afraid I've gone over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Faguet. We have time for questions.
I wanted to ask in Charagua, you were talking about the need for competitive elections, but you also said that one of the candidates swept the elections, and so I'm wondering if there's a contradiction there. If one candidate swept the elections, were they truly competitive?
Should I answer one by one, or how do you want to do it?
Whichever you prefer. Well, you can,
I'll just,
yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah. That's a good question. I think when I talk about competition, I'm talking about the underlying competition in the sense of parties being able to mobilize resources and run campaigns. I'm not describing the outcomes necessarily. So I think if it were the case that this particular political party won election after election after election over long periods of time, like the Liberal Democrats in Japan, then you have to question how competitive this is. But any one particular electoral outcome, sort of a big swing in voters one way or another, doesn't necessarily mean there's a lack of competition. What I'm basing that on is, being there qualitatively and being there during campaigns, interviewing the leaders of different political parties and finding out how many resources they had, and did they field what they felt were competitive political lists, and did they campaign actively, and so on and so forth. The form that political contributions take in that part of the world is that a cattle rancher gives you a cow. So if you're, I guess so if you're a political leader, you turn up and you say, could I have a cow? And you slaughter the cow and you barbecue it up, and then you call a rally, and your political supporters come and listen to speeches while they're eating some beef. And so what was notable is that ganaderos who supported the ADN or the MNR would still hand over a couple of cows to the Mir guy or the MBL person, political party leader, just in case. And so it seems to me that this supported some fairly vigorous political competition, as opposed to the case in Viacha. Yes?
What's the influence of President Morales and the profits from the minerals?
That's changing a lot. So the mineral profits are what account for this rise here in this curve, and especially the last tan curve here. This is basically royalties from minerals and more than that, oil and gas. There are two ways to answer that. One is, what effect is Morales having on decentralization right now? And there, I think the story is very interesting and even stunning if you put it in its historical context, because they've recently passed a big constitutional reform and also the new law of autonomies and decentralization in 2010. And I've looked at this in detail and analyzed the new law and the previous laws, the 1994 law, the 95 decentralization law, and so on and so forth. And what you see in the Morales law of decentralization is a significant deepening of decentralization, but along the lines of what had been done by previous governments, including Goni Sanchez de Lozada, the evil neoliberal who appears in Bolivia wearing devil's horns and is wanted. They're trying to get him extradited from the US to face genocide charges, or at least that's what they say they're trying to do. I don't think they're trying very hard, but that's the discourse. But if you look at the detail of this reform, what they're consciously doing, and I think intelligently doing, is trying to build on the successes of the previous law, but they're not just repeating it, they're actually deepening it and creating new layers of regional governments that are democratically elected, which Goni never did and no one before ever did. And they're devolving more resources and more powers to local governments, regional governments, and these new indigenously autonomous, I'm not sure how to say this in English, indigenous autonomous governments, which didn't exist before, which have special powers reserved to themselves. This is stunning because if you look at everything else that Morales has done, they have systematically overturned all the previous reforms. So they reversed the education reform that Sanchez Lozada did in the mid-90s. They reversed the privatization, the so-called capitalization reforms. They've renationalized the oil company. They're renationalizing the electricity and telephone and other companies, and it looks like they're going to renationalize the rails. And the third big reform that Sanchez Lozada did was a reorganization of the executive branch, which they've just undone. But decentralization, they don't seem, it seems that no government can really touch it, and what Morales has done is to deepen it. Now, if you look at it, the other way of looking at it is, what is the effect of decentralization on the rise of Evo Morales? And I think with a colleague, with a PhD student of mine at the LSE, I think there's a direct empirical link. And so if you look at Congress in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, for example, when Congress was active in between coups, you see that 95% of congressmen were white men who were landowners, businessmen, and professionals, right? And penetration into politics in Bolivia, a lot like the US in a way, in a broad way, is lateral. You don't build your way up from the grassroots. You become, I mean, I'm over-defining it, but a lot of American politics is like this. You become a wealthy or important businessman or professional or something like this, and then you go straight into the parliament. You don't start through local politics, because before there was no local politics. And now if you look at Congress, 50% of people got their start in local politics. They're ex-carpenters and truck drivers. They have names like Choquehuampa and Maita. They're no longer the Rodriguezes and Sanchez Lozadas. They look different, and they're from rural areas and small municipalities. And it seems that, and if you look at the Congressional Congress, the Constituyente, 80% of people there, of representatives there, are people from that sort of social extraction. So it seems to us that what decentralization did was to extend the ladder downwards to allow a different strata of society to rise into local politics, which before had no access to it, because you had to be a rich white man to get into politics, because politics was oligopolized. And if you look at Evo Morales, he began in local government in the Chapare, and his government, his party, the MAS, is really a coalition of a bunch of local and indigenous, a very local sort of village level or regional level movements with indigenous movements that doesn't really have a formal party structure. It's this loose coalition that's really just headed by the very charismatic Evo Morales. So on the one hand, it seems like decentralization created him in some sense, or at least played an important role in creating him and his political movement. And on the other hand, he's very definitely deepening it now. Sorry, that was an extended answer, but I mean, I think it's an important topic in current Bolivian history.
Hi, I've done a bunch of research in El Alto and Santa Cruz. It's fascinating to hear about this. I'm looking at the law of participation as well. But my research in El Alto raises a question that there they do actually devolve a lot of the resources to the community level and to the district level, but then there's an incredible level of corruption there. And so on paper, if you just went for a week, it would look great. They're having these assemblies all over the place, but then what actually happens is that there's a massive leakage in terms of where the resources are ending up going. And in 2010 and then 2011, the MAS government that was there had an 11% completion rate of what they'd actually done over the last couple of years. So that makes me sort of wonder about some of the results, which I'm sure you couldn't get into all the evidence, but even though they're devolving and having all these assemblies, how confident can you be of that not happening in the successful cases that you're looking at, where it looks good, but then when you actually sort of plug into it, it falls apart a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm sure you're right about El Alto. I haven't studied it in depth like you have, but that rings true. El Alto has a long-term endemic problem with endemic corruption that comes from well before the MAS. Local governments have been hugely corrupt there for a long time. Part of this style of research is to admit that there's going to be huge variation, and so when I talk about the good case and the bad case, and then the bad case 13 years later becomes good, I'm not trying to suggest or kind of brainwash people into thinking that local government is good everywhere because it's decentralized. I mean, I have no doubt that there's massive corruption all over the country. The question is, the larger question is, what do you think was going on with this? Right? I mean, these sorts of patterns of investment are not consistent with a lack of corruption, right? So it seems, so we have to, when we talk about decentralization, we have to think about it. You know, it's a process of change. It's a policy change over time. It's a very long-winded process. It doesn't happen very quickly, like again, a change in a marginal tax rate or a change in a tariff. It takes a long time to settle in because it changes dynamics that themselves, local dynamics that themselves have to settle down for good or for ill. My argument is that after decentralization, local governments were relatively more responsive than central governments had been, than the central government had been before, which is why you get these sorts of changes, right? But this is not to say that local governments are not corrupt or that corruption has gone away. I fully buy, and it's sort of, your observation calls for more research, because there are other places like Charagua, but also some big cities. Sucre is fairly competently and cleanly run. And Sucre is a big city, you know, sort of on a similar scale. It's smaller, but it's in the same order of El Alto. So you could ask the question, why is one big city good and one big city bad? And, you know, I mean, I think it's a rich vein of research there. Yes?
It's hard to imagine a North American city where municipal government would improve when the big industry shuts down. I mean, think about Detroit or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm the non-academic. Does that mean that all of the money is coming from the central government? And, I mean, the money for the civic services, for the municipal services is also being devolved? I mean, they're not dependent economically on
Yeah, I mean, I think
locally?
Viacha had the great good fortune of seeing this particular change happen at a time when the national resources are extremely buoyant because of what somebody mentioned before, natural resources, right? So Bolivia is living with Evo Morales right now, but I mean, it's just sort of, it's his luck. Bolivia is living a period unlike any other period in certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, and very certainly in, you know, modern Bolivia, post-1952 revolution times, when all of its natural resource prices are at sky-high levels, and this has never happened before. Under Banzer, Bolivia had a big boom because oil and gas prices were high, but mineral prices were rock bottom. Previously, under the MNR, under Victor Paz Estenssoro, mineral prices were very high, but oil and gas prices were not, and they hadn't discovered very much oil or gas anyway. So now the mineral prices are high and the oil and gas prices are high. Non-traditional exports like soya are just booming. The Chinese and the Colombians are buying up all the soya they can produce. So, I mean, you're right that they closed down the factory, and the city of Viacha loses some significant local tax revenues, but the transfers they're getting are at sky-high levels, and that makes up for that. And so what that allows to be the case is that the main effect is that the political distortion is lifted, right? If this had happened at a bad period economically for Bolivia and for Viacha, then there would have been better local politics, but much less money. But the less money effect gets sort of canceled out by luck. So, but no, I mean, I take your point. If GM and if the car companies had all gone bust and closed down for good, then places like Detroit would have suffered hugely.
What happened to the doctor?
He didn't get elected. No, he ran in the number 6 position. I mean, he was, I think.
No, but I mean when you went back.
Oh, when I went back?
Yeah.
Oh, no, he's too old. I mean, he's out of politics. He's no longer on. In today's Bolivia, those old parties are gone. I mean, so this new study that I want to do, that I was hinting at vis-a-vis the changes in the composition of Congress and the new politics, is really about the collapse of the old political party system, where you had a stable equilibrium amongst parties arrayed from left to right, you know, pro-labor, versus pro-capital, pro-poor people or indigenous people versus pro-businessmen, with the MNR in the middle as a sort of fulcrum party. And that whole system is gone. It's not just that the MNR is gone. That whole stable equilibrium of competing parties in that kind of dimension is gone forever. And what you have is a new politics, so the sort of the dimension of competition is shifted. What American political scientists from the 50s, Schatzschneider, called it a dimensional change in politics. And now people don't care about left or right, capital or labor. Now they care about identity and about indigenous people and about colonial history and also about where you live. And sadly for Bolivia right now, indigenous identity and geography line up pretty clearly. That's starting to break down because a lot of people from the west of the country, a lot of highlanders are moving in ever greater numbers to places like Santa Cruz and the Beni, and so they're changing the complexion of politics in the way that they hadn't before. I mean, this is a long-term movement, but the numbers are increasing now under Evo Morales. But so now when you go back to Viacha, the short answer is the mirror is gone. And anybody who was associated with the mirror or the ADN or the MNR are just irrelevant now. They can't do polygons.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Faguet. Thanks everyone for coming. And before you leave, let me say that Professor Faguet's book, Decentralization and Popular Democracy, is for sale in the back if you're interested in getting it. Thank you.
Thank you.